within each sector, firms in high productivity cities and regions, say in the north, and low productivity regions and cities in the south, largely face the same wage schedule. Germany used to have a similar, not unlike the Italian one before unification, but after unification made it more flexible through a number of changes. There's still union contract, there's still collective bargaining systems, but firms can deviate and can negotiate locally. And this allows German salaries to be more responsive to local productivity, levels. So we study both the local and the aggregate effects of collective bargaining systems in these two countries. The paper is made of two parts. In the first part, we provide some simple evidence on the relationship between local firm productivity at the province level and local nominal wages, local non-employment rates, and local real wages, defined as nominal wages net of local cost of living, mainly cost of housing, really. And then in the second part, we quantify the aggregate cost of spatial misallocation in Italy, which has the more rigid system compared to Germany in terms of foregone employment and labor earnings. The data are at the provincial level. Italy has 103 provinces with an average population of about 500,000 people. In Germany, there is the equivalent of provinces. There are 96, and they are larger. They have an average population of 800,000 people. Wages and unemployment rates comes from Istat for Italy and EAB for Germany. I want to be clear, the only evidence we're going to show is going to be cross-sectional. We don't have, unfortunately, some of the key data at the provincial level are not available for the reunification, for the years just before reunification or just after reunification for Germany. So all the evidence will be cross-sectional comparisons. And wages, when I say wages, these are conditional wages, conditional on worker characteristics. We also have some estimates of the informal sector, which is quite important in Italy, by province from the Bank of Italy. Housing costs are measured for Italy based on data from the Osservatorio Immobiliare Italiano and Germany from the BBSR. And then our key variable that measures local productivity, it's the gross value added per worker. It was going to be the mean by province, and it comes from the OECD. So let me tell you about wage setting in Italy and Germany before I show you the results. In Italy, national agreements between unions and employers set a wage floor for each industry and occupational level. The industries are defined quite narrowly. For example, there are 34 contracts in the chemical industry, 31 in textile, and 39 in food production. And overall, there are exactly 346 national agreements covering the vast majority of workers. With limited exceptions, Italian firms cannot pay below these floors, irrespective of their specific product demand, profitability, and productivity. Now, national contract sets, the way we're thinking about this is that these floors are not too far from the market clearing level in the northern, more productive regions. And this reflects the fact that northern employers really dominate the process, especially manufacturing, which is the wage setting industry that starts all the bargaining agreements. Confindustria, which is the main employer association, is dominated by northern firms, is traditionally led by a northern president, and unions as well are dominated by tend to be dominated by northern workers. And empirically consistent with the notion that unions and employers seem to be bargaining with market clearing level for the north in mind, is the fact that in a typical non-recession year, employment is not too far from full employment in many provinces in the north, but it's almost always higher in the south. There's structural unemployment in the south, even outside recession. Now, in practice, I don't want to give you the sense that wages are numerically identical for a given occupational level in the private sector across the whole country. There is some degree of flexibility, of course. First of all, national contracts do allow for limited amount of geographical differentiation. Second, firms can always pay above the floor. Nothing stops employers to pay above the contract. There's merit pay. Recently, there's been these fixed term contracts that allow wages below national contracts for a limited number of employees. And possibly most importantly, firms can pay under the table. Therefore, outside, below what the contract establishes. So in the private sector, we should expect some wage compression at the nominal level, of course, not identical salaries. And that's even more true in our data, which are survey data that are obviously going to also have some measurement error. By contrast, wages in the public sector are uniform, are numerically the same. So a teacher literally makes the same salary in Milano and in Sicily for a given level of seniority, mechanically. Now, you can see this is an example of one collective bargaining contract for Italy. It's for the construction sector. It's for one specific occupation of the construction sector. These are not labor market data. These are what the contract specifies. They're coming from the for the Ministry of Labor, and this is what this is the how the contract is set. Okay, so I'm not talking about realized wages here. It's the contract. And what you see in the and the mean is the mean across provinces. Mean and max and standard deviation is across provinces, as defined by the contract. So what you see are the different components that go into deciding how much a construction worker sector of a given occupational level, how his salary will be established. And what you see is essentially a very limited amount of geographical variability. For most of these components, the most important ones, there is literally zero amount of geographical variability allowed. For example, the first one, you can see there is zero standard deviation allowed across provinces. But even when there is some allowance, some degree of geographical flexibility, it's limited. And so when you look at the bottom, when you see the total average hourly cost of labor, you see that the standard deviation it's 0.6 versus a mean of 24. Okay, so yes, the contracts allow some provinces, some workers to be paid a little bit more or less in some provinces, but not by much. These are an example of 3 employers. These are actually labor market data. These are just employers for which we have good data on. One is a bank. So we look at bank tellers, a given level of occupation and seniority. You see the mean wage within a bank across branches in different regions. And you see that there is very limited geographical variation for this private sector employer. The second one is an energy company. You also see not a lot of variation in the north, central, and south. And then the third one is just an example of a public sector occupation. Literally, this is mechanically as zero variation. Now, Germany, before unification, had a more rigid system, not unlike the Italian system. After unification, there was a decrease in the coverage of the sectoral level bargaining agreements and an increase in firm level agreements. So we're still talking about collective bargaining system, but away from the national and Länder level and more to the firm level. There were a number of motivation. I think the Eastern German firms realized that they needed some flexibility because they were facing much lower productivity. Also, there was the threat of productions moving to Eastern Europe and a number of other reasons that generated a decline in the percentage of workers covered by collective bargaining system. You can see that in column 1 shows you the percentage of workers under an industry contract. In the West, it was 69% in 1996. and is now half, or I'm sorry, in 2013 is half. And in the East, it was 56%, and now it's a third. And so a large decline, which means that German collective bargaining now allows more flexible wage settings that can adjust to local productivity conditions. And Dassman and as a number of papers that have documented these changes and their effects. Firms have discretion in recognizing sectoral level bargaining, so they can join or not join those bargaining. And even when they do join, even when they are covered by one of these collective bargaining agreements, they can deviate through opening clauses. Let me skip the model in the interest of time. I think the model is I'm going to direct you to the paper if you're interested. It's just a standard. There's nothing really innovative in the model. It's the standard Rosen-Rohrbach model in the case of a free market equilibrium where wages can adjust and therefore are going to be proportional to the local productivity. And in a case where there's collective bargaining, and so wages cannot fully adjust, and therefore they're not going to be fully proportional. And the whole point of the model is to see what happens to employment, investment, cost of living in a spatial equilibrium when workers and firms can move.
Enrico, sorry, one question. So I didn't finish what you have to say, and then I'm gonna ask my question.
No,
yeah. So do you allow for workers' mobility across areas? Because there might be a counter effect whereby the most productive workers might want to bid for the jobs where prices are lower, where real wages are higher, and there might be an offsetting effect, I imagine, right?
Yes. Yes, that's a good question. So the model, yes, definitely allows for worker mobility. In fact, the whole point of the model is a spatial equilibrium model where workers can move across places. They optimally decide where to move, and in doing so, they compare the nominal wages that they can earn in different places, the cost of living, just as you indicated. It's just like in the standard Rosen-Rohrbach equilibrium, the marginal worker, there's one marginal worker indifferent between the two regions, and then there's a bunch of inframarginal workers that are not indifferent. And the same is true in the non-market, in the not free market equilibrium, the one where you have wage floors. So in terms of evidence, in the first part of the paper, we look at the relationship between local firm productivity and nominal wages, non-employment rates, and cost of living and real wages. I think I can describe really most of the evidence on the paper with three simple graphs that I think are gonna illustrate well these three relationships. Okay. Let me show you the spatial distribution of productivity as measured by mean value added per worker. So this is the province level of productivity of firms. And not surprisingly, the north of Italy enjoys a higher level of productivity than the south. This is probably, there is hundreds of books written in Italy about this. It probably reflects historical differences in transportation infrastructure, distance from European markets, local provision of local productive public goods, cultural norms, the efficiency of local governments, and so on. We're going to take those differences as given. We're not going to explain those differences, but we're going to try to look at the consequences of those productivity differences. Germany also, not surprisingly, shows vast differences in productivity across places, with the East being much less productive than the West. In this case, probably the main reason is 60 years of communist rule in the East. You can see the differences at the bottom when you look at the East in the histograms. The blue is the north for Italy, and the white is the south for Italy. And for Germany, the blue is the west, and the white is the east. What's interesting is that the differences in productivity between north-south in Italy and east-west in Germany are generally comparable. In fact, the mean difference in productivity for Italy between the north and the south is about 22%, with the average southern province in Italy being 22% less productive than the average northern one. And the same, and the difference in Germany is 20%. So roughly speaking, you have similar productivity differences across regions, but the nominal wage differences are quite different between the two countries. Italy, of course, the nominal wages are higher in the north than in the south, but the differences is not enormous. In fact, if you see at the histogram, at the bottom, you see there is quite a significant amount of overlap between the blue representing the north and the white representing the south. And this likely reflect the binding nature of the national contracts in Italy. By contrast, look at Germany. Wages in Germany, nominal wages in Germany in the east are much lower than the rest of the country. And you can see it from the map, and you can see even more clearly from the histogram at the bottom, where the blue again is the west. There's almost no overlap in Germany between the west and the east. So the first relationship that we're going to study is the relationship between local wages and local value added. If nominal wage can fully adjust to productivity differences, the Rosen-Rohrbach model predicts that there should be a tight relationship between local value added and wages, meaning that areas that have high mean value added, the more productive areas, should also have proportionally higher nominal wages. An area with low productivity should have lower wages. That's exactly what you see in the US. In a paper with Rick Orbeck, we look at TFP, differences across metropolitan statistical areas in the US, and changes in TFP. And we established that, among other things, when you have a shock to productivity to an area, you see increases in nominal wages, almost one-to-one. In terms of log wages on log TFPs. On the other hand, if nominal wages are prevented from fully adjusting, we should see a weaker relationship between productivity and nominal wages. In fact, in the extreme case of fully binding national contracts, with complete nominal wage equalization, we should see no relationship at all. This is what we see in Italy at the top and in Germany. So the x-axis is the log value added by province. The y-axis is the log conditional nominal wage after controlling for worker characteristics. And each dot is a province. So you can think of each dot as the mean conditional wage, conditional worker characteristics. What you see in Italy is a weak relationship between log value added and log nominal wages. And what you see in Germany is more akin to what you see in the US, a stronger relationship between, so another way of saying is that provinces to the right in Germany, the more productive provinces, enjoy higher nominal wages than provinces to the left. While in Italy, the difference is much more muted. Again, probably reflecting this nationwide contracts, the more binding nature of nationwide contracts in Italy. And these are the corresponding regression. Column 1 and 3 are the ones that correspond to the figure. The slope for Italy is 0.19. The slope for Germany is 0.73. In column 2 and 4, we look at within macro regions. We add region fixed effects. So the comparison is not north versus south in Italy anymore. It's within the north and within the south, more productive versus less productive provinces. And the same is true for Germany. The coefficient for Italy drops to 1.3, and for Germany it drops a lot to 0.37, but it's still, the coefficient for Germany is still 3 times larger than the coefficient for Italy, indicating much higher elasticity of nominal wages relative to local productivity in Germany. Again, these are, in my mind, these results directly stems from the institutional differences between the countries. Now, more interesting is what happens to non-employment and real wages, because those are the equilibrium adjustments that follow from the institutional differences. German firms appear to be significantly more able to adjust to nominal wages, to adjust nominal wages to local productivity conditions than Italian firms. Now, In Italy, where wages cannot fully adjust, the relationship between local non-employment and local value added should be stronger than in Germany, where wages can adjust more. And that's indeed what you see in the data. Okay, these are the non-employment rate by province. Not surprisingly, non-employment is much higher in the south of Italy than in the north. But look at Germany, look at the map of Germany. You don't really see a huge difference between the east and the west in unemployment. There is some, but it's not as pronounced as in Italy. And this is even more clear when you look at the bottom of the histograms, where again, blue is the north. North non-employment rate are much lower than southern Italian non-employment rates. There's almost no overlap. But when you look at the histogram for Germany, you see a much stronger degree of overlap between the East and the West. The point that we're trying to make is that in equilibrium, the least productive Italian regions, because they're paying wages that are essentially set with northern Italian levels in mind, they're as an effect, in equilibrium, they're facing higher non-employment rate. And this is clear when you plot non-employment against value added. Again, so the x-axis, again, it's log value added by province. Each dot is a province. And the y-axis is log non-employment rate. Look at Germany. Germany, you see a plot that is not unlike the one that you see in the US, where there is a slightly negative relationship, but is not very pronounced. And the reason is that wages can adjust. So the least productive regions in the East, essentially by paying lower wages, can offset some of that lower productivity. For Italy, the least productive region, the regions on the right side of that graph, they are facing too high nominal wages, and therefore in equilibrium they're experiencing a higher level of unemployment or non-employment. These are the corresponding regressions. Column 1 and column 5 are the one corresponding to the graph that I just showed you. And column 2 and column 6 are the one within, including regional fixed effect. As you can see, comparing column 2 with column 6, the elasticity for Italy is minus 0.5, and is about 5 times higher than the elasticity for Germany, which is only minus 0.1. Now, one big issue in Italy is, of course, informal employment, or people who have a job but are paid under the table. I should have said that these regressions are based on an employment status that is self-reported in a survey. So it's not like official administrative data. So in theory, respondents here should have not a big incentive in respondents in the informal sector should still respond that they're employed if they're employed. So in theory, this regression should already reflect the non-employment sector. But what we do, we use the Bank of Italy estimate of informal employment to inflate the employment rate or to deflate the non-employment rate accordingly in order to see if our results change. I mean, the first thing that we do is we look at whether there's a relationship between the share of informal employment and productivity. And as you might expect, there is. The most productive regions have the least amount of informal employment, and the least productive region have the most amount of informal employment. This is likely to be an equilibrium adjustment. Right? If you are a low productivity province and you're facing wages set in Milano that are much higher, or in the rest of the north that are much higher, one equilibrium form of adjustment is you still employ people, but you pay them under the table. When you adjust our measure of employment with Bank of Italy estimate of informal employment, and you redo the relationship between value added and employment, in this case is adjusted employment, you see that the relationship holds. It remains quite negative, and despite the fact that there's more informal employment in the least productive regions, the relationship holds. And you can see it quantitatively in column 3 and 4 of the table. This is the same table that I showed you before, but I'm now going to point your attention on column 3 and 4, where the outcome variable, the left-hand side variable, is not non-employment, but is adjusted non-employment, meaning adjusted for the Bank of Italy estimate of informal employment. Let me pause here and see if people have questions on this part. Yeah, Ewan.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, another way that Germany can adjust to shocks is with Kurzarbeit, which is an agreement whereby employers agree not to fire people, and then employees take a wage cut and they get paid directly by the government. And that is a very common feature that many companies use whenever they hit a rough patch. So not just during now like recessions, but also outside recession when companies have a difficulty. I'm not familiar with Italy, but I wonder whether the non-employment effect is also reflecting other forces at play in Germany.
Yeah, I think Italy has a similar institution. It's called Cassa Integrazione. Essentially, the government pays the struggling firm to not to fire people for a while. I think it certainly helps with idiosyncratic shocks in the same way that the German counterpart helps. I would say that a lot of that is really cyclical, in the sense that, for example, right now, that's a major way in which the Italian government is supporting employment, essentially by paying firms labor costs. Here, the focus is not really on the cyclical component. It's on structural differences, long-run differences, and cross-sectional differences. So I don't know if the German counterpart of Cassa Integrazione is more or less generous or more or less aggressive compared to the Italian one during the cycle. But the focus of this, it's really equilibrium differences in non-employment irrespective of the business cycle. I'm not seeing the question, so if people have questions, please do stop me anytime. I'm not following the.
Hey.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi Enrico. Thank you very much for the presentation. I see the point that the cross-sectional differences in wages does not match the cross-sectional differences in productivity. But then the question is, if wages are too low, too high in the South because of the collective bargain process, or if they are too low in the North because of some other reason. And your point is that they are too high in the South because wages are set according to northern preferences and equilibrium, and that's a key part of your mechanism. And your point for sustaining that is that trade union people and also the association of employers are mainly from the North. I wonder if you can look at something different, for instance, like, do the wage increases over time in specific sector match productivity increases in the North or in the South? Because I think that's a key mechanism, and it would be good, like, to see something more about that, I think.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Look at sector-specific, idiosyncratic sector-specific shocks and see whether they adjust, and see whether sector-specific and region-specific shocks to specific sectors. Yeah, we can probably do that. The third piece of evidence that we're going to show, so I show you the relationship between nominal wages and productivity, between non-employment and productivity. The third piece of evidence is on cost of living and real wages. So real wages are defined as nominal wages minus the properly weighted cost of living, or divided by the properly weighted cost of living index. Most of the differences in cost of living stem from differences in cost of housing, but also from differences in the cost of non-tradable goods and services. So an haircut in Milan probably costs more than a haircut in Sicily. So we compute real wages by taking nominal wages and deflating them based on cost of living in the province. Now, this goes back to Marco's earlier question about mobility. Workers can move across regions. Nothing stops Southern Italians to move to the north, and vice versa. Nothing stops Eastern German to move to the west. So low value added areas should have lower housing prices, both in Italy and in Germany. The implication for real wages, defined as nominal wages deflated by cost of living, are that in Germany, we should see a positive or a non-negative association between real wages and local value added. And this is what you see in the US. The areas that are more productive tend to have higher nominal wages, higher cost of living, but the increasing cost of living is not enough to fully undo the higher nominal wages. And that's what we see, Rick Orbeck and I see in the US when we track the effect of city-specific productivity shocks. We see an increase in nominal wages, we see an increase in cost of living, we see on net an increase in real wages. In Italy, we should see a negative relationship between real wages and local value added. The reason is that the South essentially faces a similar level of nominal wages than the North, much lower cost of living. And so the real wage would be much higher, should be higher in the South for those who are conditional on having a job. And this is what you see. I mean, the first graph is, the first map shows the housing cost, which tend to be higher in the north in Italy and tend to be higher in the west in Germany. And this is the map for real wages. Remarkably, real wages in Italy are on average a little bit higher in the south than in the north. By contrast, in Germany, just like in the US, the most productive regions tend to have the highest real wages. I want to compare this. I mean, I find this inversion for Italy remarkable. It's the only country in the world that I know of where you see this. Let me go back to the nominal wage map. This is the nominal wage map for Italy. You can see, I mean, it's compressed, but there's some gradient that shows that the north has slightly higher nominal wages than the south. This is the real wage, which almost it's an inversion, and again, it's an equilibrium reaction to the compression in nominal wages. It's as I said, I mean, the typical pattern that you see is more like Germany. These are the graphs. Again, the x-axis is productivity, and the y-axis here is log real wage. In Germany, just like in the US and in other countries for which we have data, you see a slightly positive relationship. It's less pronounced than the relationship for nominal wages, because of course cost of living erodes some of the advantages of living in a productive area in equilibrium. But for Italy, it's actually negative. And this is even more remarkable when you look at this table where I'm showing the average wage differences between North and South Italy and West and East Germany in nominal and in real terms. So column 1 and 3 are for nominal, column 2 and 4 are for real. So in Germany, the nominal differences between East and West is 29% nominal and 17% real. So part of the nominal, so part of the higher wages that somebody enjoys living in Bavaria relative to the East are eroded by the higher cost of living. And therefore, when you look at real differences between the more productive region and these productive regions, they're smaller than in nominal terms. In Italy, it's not that they're smaller, the sign flips. You go from a 4% difference in nominal wages to a minus 9%. So you go from the nominal wages being higher in the north to the average real wage being higher in the south.
I mean, Enrico, one thing is that the difference in real wages is not just between the South and the North. There's also big differences across very local areas within the North and within the South.
Yes.
How are we going to think about them? I mean, it's hard to think that these are just compensating differentials and people are happy where they are, or that the mobility costs across two adjacent provinces in the North are so high. Does it mean that maybe the composition of employment is very different across adjacent places? And so basically there isn't mobility.
Yeah, I think that's actually leads me to the next, to the way I'm thinking about it. Let me address the issue of amenities and worker difference in a second. But the way I'm thinking about this equilibrium is the following: is that employed Italians, so conditional on having a job, it seems to be the case that you're better off in terms of real wages, working in the South than in the North, because you have a higher purchasing power. However, the probability of finding a job is lower in the South. So what this is saying is that national wage contracts have created a special equilibrium where workers are queuing for jobs in the South. If they find a job, they have higher real wages than their colleagues in the North. But while they're queuing, they remain unemployed. I guess one way in which this works in the Italian context is through a family, is that people are living with their parents a long time, being supported by their parents, and they're waiting for finding a job for a long time. Marco and I have a paper on how long Italian children stay with their parents. In that case, we're focusing on different motivations, but it's also true that Italian family actually acts as a way of redistributing resources. It's almost like there's a lottery. If you win the lottery in the South, you get a job, you get a higher nominal wage, but a higher real wage. But you're waiting to win. While you're waiting to win the lottery, you're remaining unemployed or not employed. And this is obviously a very costly and socially inefficient, socially disruptive equilibrium. Now, Barbara, you were asking about differences within region. I think this is the same is true within the North and within the South. There are parts of the South that are more productive than the rest, and there are parts of the North that are not as productive as the North. So it's not just a North-South difference. It's also true within macro region, but I think it's particularly pronounced when we're looking at it across between the North and the South.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So it seems that, I mean, the description.
Now I see you, yes. Okay.
Yeah, so the description is very appeals with the people who know Italy and Germany a little. The question then is the political economy of this, right? Who are the winners and who are the losers? And as you pointed out, in the South, even we have winners, the guys who have jobs, so they're insiders, and then there's outsiders. Yeah. So the question maybe is a historical setting of why the employer in the North have incentive of setting the wage in the South. You can think about maybe because they're in competition with each other, so you want them to have higher wages, but that only should apply to tradable goods. But then to non-tradables, right? Why should I care about the price of haircuts in Sicily, or the construction? One of the leading examples you showed, right? Why should I care about the wages in construction in the South? So what's the political economy that? How do you think about the political economy of this?
So in this specific paper, we're not asking the question of why this is and what how come this is a political economy equilibrium, but we are asking the question: who are the winner and who are the loser, and how, and could if there was a reform, could the winners compensate the losers? And this is indeed what I'm about to discuss. Is think about a system where the Italians adopt the German.
Can I ask you one quick question before?
Yeah.
Which is very related to the previous slide. Which is, so perhaps I'm wrong, but my understanding is that there tends to be migration in Italy from the South to the North, right? So how are you thinking about this internal migration in light of these findings?
Right. So internal migration always occur. I mean, each province is hit by shocks all the time, and there's readjustment. I think it's a true fact that the big numbers of migration are over. The times of big migration from the south to the north is over. That the millions of people leaving southern rural areas to go to northern factories is a thing of the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, and is not occurring anymore. I think that spatial equilibrium is actually quite a decent representation of why that's not happening, in part because cost of living adjusts for that. And so in our spatial equilibrium, there's not like a difference in utility for the marginal workers across places. There's somebody on the margin of moving from the south to the north, and that person is indifferent between the two regions. So in the absence of shocks, people are perfectly content. Now, in practice, of course, there is migration. People are constantly readjusting, and there's a lot of reason for that. Some are systematic, some are idiosyncratic, but that's just a movement toward a new equilibrium. It's not necessarily.
Yeah, but the unemployed would not be indifferent, right? Because in the high wage region, they're kind of miserable.
Good question. The unemployed are indifferent because in the south, because they're waiting for the lot to win the lottery. They're indifferent because in expectation, they're waiting to get the job. And as I was saying, I mean, the way to think about it is that they're like living longer with their family or waiting to form their family and so on.
But that's why I was kind of relating more the questions to like small differences within the north or within the south, because in that case, I mean, the option of waiting might be inferior to the option of moving to the next province if you're unemployed. So apparently, I mean, either the family network is very local, and then even the unemployed are indifferent. Or
sure.
Yeah.
That's a fair point. That's probably true. And there's a tons of local differences between contiguous provinces, but the same. I think you can apply the same logic and the same reasoning that applies north-south to movement across provinces. Of course, the movement across provinces is less costly, but the same notion of equilibrium can be extended there.
I have a question, because you mentioned Confindustria at the beginning of the presentation. So I was thinking now, hearing the last question about winners and losers, don't you think that entrepreneurs in the north might be among the winners? Because if you look at labor share, I saw a slide before comparing log wage with log productivity in Germany and Italy, and it seemed to me, at least at first sight, that productivity seems to be comparable, while wages are much lower in Italy. So also to reconnecting with the previous question about the fact that maybe it's wages in the north to be too low instead of wages in the south to be too high. I was wondering if we can think in terms of political economy of this situation, like lobbying by entrepreneurs in the north, managing to keep wage low enough in the north.
Possibly. It's a good point. We have very little to add to say in this paper about those political economy. I mean, I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm saying that every comparison that we make in this paper is within a country. We have little to say about the overall level of wages in Italy and in Germany. They might reflect a number of other reasons, a number of nationwide institutional factors, a number of other, and we don't really take a stand on why on the levels. We're comparing relative wages within each country for a given institutional arrangement. But I think both political economy hypotheses that you guys have raised are very plausible. On the winner and loser part, let's talk about what would happen if Italy adopted a system not unlike the German one. Okay? What would happen, for example, if nominal wages were allowed to reflect local productivity more? Not necessarily one-to-one, like the Rosen-Roback model would predict, but at least the same amount that we see in Germany. Well, in that case, nominal wages would decline in low productivity provinces, but employment would increase. Okay, so the main losers, if you relax the Italian system and you adopt the German system, would be incumbent Southern workers. And the main winner would be the people who don't have a job now in the South or in low productivity provinces. Now, if the elasticity of labor demand is larger than 1, the increase in employment would be percentage-wise would be larger than the decline in wages. And so the wage bill, the overall wage bill or labor earnings would increase in the nation. Put differently, an elastic labor demand implies that increasing local employment would be proportionally larger than the decline in wages. And that would mean that labor income would increase in Italy. Okay, so to get a sense of the quantity, of how big of an effect are we talking about, we quantify the local and aggregate effects of this type of reform in Italy. We estimate a counterfactual level of employment in each province and level of wages in each province by applying to Italy the elasticity of wages with respect to value added and the elasticity of employment with respect to value added that's for Germany. Okay, so we take just the reduced form relationship between wages and productivity, between employment and productivity, and we apply the reduced form parameters that we find in Germany, we apply them to Italy to predict for a given level of productivity what would be the wage level in each province and what would be the employment level in each province if Italy adopted the German way of bargaining, of collective bargaining. To be clear, we are not assuming that wages, employment, or value added are the same in Italy and in Germany. We're saying for a given level of productivity in each Italian province, we are predicting wages and employment based on German on the reduced form parameters that we have estimated. I think Francia had a question.
Yes, strategy, if I had to look at that question, would be to take a given firm that has multiple establishments in the north and in the south, or in the east and in the west, and see how much mobility there is in terms of careers, and what's the employment level for the same kind of, organization. Take two bank agencies, one in the north, one in the south. You would expect that in the south you would have less, the number of people would be smaller. And how is the wage of the same? So try to understand for something very comparable, say movements within a bank or movements within a large company, both in East Germany and West Germany, both in Italy, well, in Italy, it's not, how that works, how firms adjust.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. When you say bank, actually, that sounds very appealing because my co-author, Andrea, has this internal data from a specific bank that has branches all over Italy. I mean, the ideal to implement your question, Francis, would be to have a bank that is in Germany and in Italy and has branches in the east and the west, and the south and the north.
Yeah.
And look at that. It's something certainly to be worth doing. In this specific exercise, though, we are essentially trying to take German elasticities and apply to Italian provinces. So, for example, in Germany, a 10% value-added difference is associated with a 7.4% wage difference. We're going to assume that the same is true in Italy. So we're going to talk. We take a southern province with value-added 10% below median, then the north. In that case, the counterfactual wage set will be set 7.4% lower than the median in the north. And the same is true for employment. And what you get is, and again, I want to stress, there's no, we're still allowing, we're not assuming, we're not constraining wages in Italy, employment level in Italy, or value-added level in Italy to be the same with the one in Germany, by any means. We also have a second counterfactual, which is based on the model. We take seriously the Rosen-Rohrbach model, and we are looking at, we're saying what would happen if Italy by relaxing its labor market institutions, went to a full free market equilibrium where there is no constraint. It's not even the German level. It's like there's one-to-one adjustment. So for each 1 percentage point difference in productivity, nominal wages adjust fully by 1%. And these are like the counterfactual changes in nominal wages and in employment that you see in the South by province. So some provinces with in terms of nominal wages, obviously nominal wages would tend to go down, and employment would tend to go up more in some provinces than in others. The final aggregate results are here. The top panel is for wages, the middle panel is for employment, and the bottom panel is for aggregate labor income, meaning the wage bill, meaning hours work. Jobs times employment times wages, or probability of employment times wages. By looking at column 2, and I'm going to focus on counterfactual 1, which is the one I described. Counterfactual 2 is the more extreme one, driven by the model, but not necessarily driven by the data. Counterfactual 1 is the one where we are using German elasticities to predict employment and wages in each Italian province. And when you look at column 2 for counterfactual 1, you see that on average, wage in the southern province would decline by 50 cents an hour. Employment in the south would increase by 12%. And overall labor income in the south would increase by 114 euros per month, meaning that the increase in employment would more than offset the decline in wages. And when you look at what happens for Italy overall, in column 7, you see that overall wages would decline. The average overall wage in Italy would decline by 2%. Employment would increase, and aggregate labor income would increase by about 7%. Okay, so by adopting the German collective bargaining system, there will be more jobs in the south, lower wages, and higher overall aggregate income, and that also applies to the country as a whole. So the first conclusion that I have is, just to sum up, is that we find a weaker relationship between local productivity and local nominal wages in Italy compared to Germany, likely reflective of the difference in collective bargaining systems in the two countries. Crucially, we find a stronger relationship between local productivity and local non-employment in Italy compared to Germany. Put differently, low productivity German provinces don't have much higher non-employment rate than high productivity German provinces. By contrast, low productivity Italian provinces have much higher non-employment rates than high productivity Italian provinces. And at third, we find that in Italy, the least productive provinces have the highest real wages because they have similar nominal wages, but lower cost of living. And this is, I believe, is the only country in the world where this has been documented. We consider what would happen if Italy adopted a similar system, a system that is more similar to Germany. And we find that the average wages in the south would decrease by 53 cents an hour. Southern employment would increase. And then the aggregate earnings would also increase. Nationwide, aggregate employment and aggregate earnings would also increase. And our best estimate are about 600 additional euros per year for each working age adult if the system was was adopted. So going back to the question of the winners and losers, the losers of this reform would be the incumbent Southern workers. The winners would be the incumbent unemployed workers. On net, the winners win more than the loser lose. So there should be room for compensating the losers if one wanted to adopt this type of reform, at least in principle. The second conclusion is that this is interesting for the Italy and Germany, but it might also extend to other countries. When you look at European countries, there are some that are more similar to the Italian model and others that are more similar to the German model. Of course, labor market institutions are complicated, and we don't mean that that they are identical, but generally speaking, when you're thinking about nationwide contracts, France, Belgium, Portugal, Finland, Iceland, and Slovenia appears closer to Italy, while Austria, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden would seem in a spectrum closer to Germany. There have been some recent movers. Greece, Portugal, and Spain have moved from a system that was closer to the Italian one to a system that seems a little bit more flexible and close to the German one. And France has been talking about decentralization for a long time, and Macron was actually made it a big deal in his campaign, but wasn't able to actually fully adopt it due to union opposition. Now, the final point I want to make is that there's an interesting parallel with what the type of spatial misallocation that we see in the US. In Italy, what the argument of this paper is that local wages cannot fully adjust to local labor market conditions. So you have less productive provinces with weak local labor market conditions, but they're forced to pay above market equilibrium wages. Nothing in Italy constrains local employment. Wages are the ones that are fixed, and employment can adjust geographically. People can move. In the US, you have the opposite. There's little that preventing nominal wages from adjusting, because the minimum wage in the US is not very binding at this point. Unions are not very strong in the private sector, at least. However, local employment is constrained from adjusting there are constraints to the flow of labor, the geographical flow of labor. And in particular, there are what you're seeing happening in the last 30 years is that the regions and the cities with the highest productivity have adopted very stringent constraints to housing supply. So they don't allow new housing to be built, and therefore are implicitly constraining the expansion of the local labor market. Places like San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, New York, with some of the highest TFP levels in the nation, are hardly building new housing. They have adopted housing supply regulations that constrain the amount of new housing that can be built, and therefore implicitly constrain labor reallocation toward those high productivity regions. So what's interesting is that basically this is a form of spatial misallocation which is specular to the one that you see in Italy. In Italy, people can move, but wages cannot adjust. In the US, wages can adjust, but people cannot move. Okay, or people cannot move enough to high productivity cities. Obviously, people can move in the US and there is a lot of geographical mobility. But my point is that the high TFP cities, the one that had the most productive, the highest nominal wages, have adopted so stringent regulations that not enough people can move to those cities. And therefore, their local employment cannot expand. And so in a paper with Chang Tai-Shi, in a recent paper with Chang Tai-Shi, we find large efficiency losses in the US in the form, just like in Italy, in the form of aggregate output and aggregate earnings. Essentially, what you have in the US is that these cities, the San Franciscos, the Bostons, the Seattle, the New York, which very high TFP, they should expand much more in order to allow labor to flow to these high TFP. By not expanding,
I think we should wrap up.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you too much. So if you want to conclude, just because we have to keep the audience engaged for another full day. So we want, it's 8 p.m., 9 p.m. in Europe. But if you want to conclude.
I'm done. I think the point is that it's a very interesting specular case of spatial misallocation.
Well, first of all, Enrico, thanks so much for the thought-provoking paper. I think there's probably space for one or two quick questions if people have pressing questions for Enrico. Any questions?
So may I ask a question? So I think, Enrico, I think this is really very interesting. And maybe one interesting aspect of it would be that in comparison between Italy and the US, what you're pointing at is that in Italy, in a way we can think about it, it's intergenerational transfer in the sense that in the South, the young guys don't have jobs, but all the guys who waited enough, so in a way, old guys have already a job. So in a way, is that, fathers have jobs, sons don't, and that's fair because it's within the family. Whereas in the US is quite a tension between the New York vis-a-vis Midwest. And that creates, I think the political tension that it's creating is very different in the picture that you are giving from these two countries. I want to know if you have a thought about that, yeah.
I think that's very true. I think the way that this equilibrium can be sustained in Italy is indeed through those intergenerational transfers. In the US, the big winner of this are not necessarily the workers in these high TFP areas, are the incumbent landowners who bought land before this big increase in productivity, are the people who bought a house in San Francisco in the 80s or the 90s or the early 2000s. Are the people who bought a house in Boston in that period, the people who bought a house in Seattle in that period, who have seen the value of their house triple in that period. The workers are, in spatial equilibrium, are indifferent, and I think the spatial equilibrium model is actually not a bad approximation of reality in both countries.
Enrico, one observation that I thought an interesting metric in comparing North and South would be per capita household income, because effectively it might well be that one person working, and so the risk of not taking employment is actually shared within the household. And in a sense, I would have wanted to see that whether to what extent is equalized. I would imagine that's much lower in the South.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I think that that's probably that's probably how it works. Is that the household income and also the real household income, net of cost of living. I think your prediction will be probably much more similar between the north and the south, with basically the south having maybe one person working and two being supported but lower cost of living, and the north having maybe two people working but higher cost of living. So the two things offsetting each other. I think the household and the family are the way that this equilibrium is actually ultimately supported. It's not like people stand in line for jobs waiting and they're living off huge government transfer. It's more like they're living off family transfer.
Right. Any more questions for Enrico? Well, it seems that no, but so thanks a lot, Enrico, for being with us from California, and it was really, really interesting, and we're going to reconvene with everybody tomorrow. Thanks for being here. For the ones who stayed until now, thanks so much.